let's keep reading the Nurgla's magic tear. They're about to travel back. Behind her closed lids, Katy was aware of a sudden flash of colour, and then came a great rush of wind. She kept her eyes shut, afraid to open them. "We're here," said the Nurgla's voice. Slowly, Katy opened her eyes. They were on a vast plain with rolling tree-covered hills blue in the distance. The sun was shining and little puffs of clouds floated dreamily across the sky. "Oh, that's lovely!" Katy clapped her hands in delight, dropping the tear as she did so. "Be careful with the tear, because without it we can't go back. I mean, I can, but you can't." The Nurgla's voice was very firm. Katy got off his back and picked up the little stone tear, gathering it in the pockets of her jeans. She jumped up and down on the grass with excitement. "Please don't kick me, mate." "Where shall we go? What shall we do?" "Well, you have a walk about. I'm going to have a little doze before I go back. This earthly sunshine makes me sleepy." The Nurgla yawned. "But don't worry, the tear will look after you. If you get frightened by an animal or something, just hold it in your hand and wish to be made bigger, and you'll grow as tall as you wish. But don't forget to say scroop, or you'll keep growing." "Scroop," said Katy. "What kind of a word is that?" "It's a magic word from our planet." The Nurgla's voice in her head sounded very sleepy. He gave another big yawn, and rolling over on his side, he closed his eyes. "Don't forget the time," he said, and fell asleep. Katy looked at him a little worriedly. She thought that at the very least he would have given her a guided tour of the place. "Oh, never mind," I guess she's going to say. "Never mind," she said to herself. "I shall just have to go for a walk on my own." Katy was a very resourceful little girl and was never too worried about things. She looked around her, wondering which way to go. Then, in the distance, about a half a mile away, she saw a little collection of conical huts. "I'll go and ask the people who live there what it's like to live in the Stone Age, and then I can go back and do my homework." She set off towards the huts, enjoying the warmth of the sunshine and the scent of the flowers and the grass. Strange birds she had never seen before flew overhead, making harsh cries. As she approached the huts, several dogs came out and started barking a warning. From the nearest hut, an unkempt figure, covered in dark hair and wearing the skin of some animal which Katy could not recognise, lurched into view. He was carrying in one hand a sort of axe, which had a bone handle and a head made of stone. At the sight of Katy, he dropped his axe and stared in amazement. He gave a succession of calls in a strange guttural tongue, and more people emerged from other huts. The men all wore skins and carried weapons, and the women among them also wore clothing made from animal hides. Some hugged babies to their bosoms, and children of varying ages clung to their legs. One little girl of about 3 started to run towards Katy, curious to see this stranger at closer range. A woman, obviously her mother, ran after her and dragged her back to the enclosure. 2 of the dogs, getting bolder now, began to approach Katy, making soft growling noises in their throats. "Oh dear," thought Katy, reaching for the tear in her pocket. Perhaps I'd better get a bit bigger." The dogs were within leaping distance of her and were a fearsome sight with wolf-like fangs and yellow eyes, the hair raised in ridges along their backs. Katy held the tear firmly in her hand and wished to be made bigger. Immediately she began to grow and in no time was at a level with the top of the huts. The dogs squealed in fright and dashed back to the compound, and the rest of the community disappeared into their various homes, uttering cries of sheer terror. That's big enough, thought Katy, and tried to think of the word that Nurgla had told her to use to stop growing. Floop, she said, but she kept on upwards. Sloop, group, until still she got bigger. Then she remembered. Scroop, she cried, and she stopped growing. Thank heavens for that. She breathed a sigh of relief and looked down. She couldn't believe her eyes. The huts looked like little straw umbrellas which her mother liked to put in the drinks when they had visitors. I must be about 12 metres tall, she thought, putting the tear back into the pocket of her jeans. She knelt down and tried to look into one of the huts, but the entrance was too small for her to see anything. Then she decided there was only one way to find out what was inside, and very gently she put her thumb and forefinger around the pole sticking out the top of the hut and carefully lifted off the roof. In the middle of the floor was a fire burning, and at first the smoke obscured her view. She waved her hand over the topless hut to remove the smoke, and became aware of a little group of people clinging to each other and making frightened cries. I'm not going to hurt you, said Katy, and at the sound of her voice the little people clapped their hands to their ears. I only wanted to know what life is like here in the Stone Age, but I don't suppose you'd be able to understand what I say anyway. She looked carefully around the contents of the hut and made a mental note of them. Taking care not to damage it, Katy placed the roof back on. She stood up and wondered what to do next. 15 minutes had gone by on her watch, so she had another 45 minutes to go before she and the Nurgla had to return. It was fun being a giant, thought Katy. She could see for miles, and when she started to walk away from the huts, she found that even the bigger animals were quite small in comparison to her. A deer with huge antlers crossed her path and stopped, petrified with fear at the sight of this huge figure. Katy stooped and picked it up, smoothing the silky hide and trying to soothe its pounding heart. I wish I could tell him I only wanted to be friends, she thought, as she placed the deer back on the ground where it bounded away without a backward glance. She came to a river where the lines of rafts made of logs were drawn up alongside both banks. As soon as she appeared, the group of men who were unloading them took one look at her and ran away in all directions, their screams tiny in her ears. Katy bent down to examine what the men had been taking from the rafts. They were stones, all of them shaped like the dominoes that she had been given for Christmas by Mrs. Bramley next door. She picked them up and piled them on the shore. They had a bluish tinge, and Katy was fascinated by them. She decided to play house with them, and taking them some way from the river to the nice flat piece of grass, she began to place them in a circle. Then she laid some of the stones across the top of the circle. When she'd had enough, she went back to the river to wash, first taking off her wristwatch. She looked around after she had swilled her hands and face for something to dry herself with. The grass wasn't long enough, and then she remembered the handkerchief in her jeans pocket. She pulled it out, and as she did so, the tear dropped to the ground without her noticing. It fell among some of the blue stones on the riverbank, and because it had grown along with Katy, it was about the same size as them. All the activity and excitement had made her feel tired, and so Katy stretched out on the ground. Her wristwatch lay alongside her, and looking at it, she noted that there were 25 minutes left before she had to go back. I'll just lie here for a couple of minutes, and then I'll go and find the Nurgla. Katy closed her eyes, just to rest them, and promptly fell asleep. Meanwhile, about 10 metres away, the leader of the men who had been unloading the barges lay lay on his stomach in the grass, observing the sleeping Katy. He was very brave, but his heart was bumping loudly, very loudly, so loudly that after a time he realized that what he could hear was not his heart. The sound was coming from where the giant lay. The man's name was Ugg, son of Ag, and he was a chief. He and his men had brought the stones on the rafts, travelling many miles in the process, on the instructions of Bo the Peep, who was the priest. They were to be used to build some kind of temple. Ugg wasn't quite sure what, and he was very annoyed that this huge giant had come from nowhere and taken them away. He realized that there was not much he could do about it, but he was afraid of what Bo the Peep would say when he found out that the stones had been stolen. He might be turned into stone himself by the priest, who could be rather nasty. He wondered what he could do, all the time aware of the loud thumping noise coming from near the giant. Raising himself on his elbows, he could see that Katy was asleep, and spotting the wristwatch, he realized that it was that monstrous thing which was making all the noise. Suddenly, an idea came to him. If he could somehow get the strange noisemaker away from the sleeping giant, Bo the Peep might not be so angry about losing the stones. Squinting his eyes against the sun, Ugg studied the object. It had two enormous black animal skin ropes, either side of a thick, round device which reflected the light of the sun, and from inside this came the mysterious, magical thumping sound. Behind him he could hear his men returning fearfully to see what was happening. He turned to them and told them of his plan to take the magic object from the giant to replace the stones they had lost. The men shook their heads, saying it was too dangerous, but after Ugg had pointed out that Bo the Peep could have them all turned into stone, they reluctantly agreed to do what he said. Cautiously they crept forward, and Ugg issued instructions in a low voice as to how they would drag it away between them. 10 men would surround the head of the giant, armed with spears in case it awoke, while the others would carry the magic device away down to the river. "It's got to be done quickly," he whispered, having a little trouble doing so owing to the bone he wore through his nose. And so, as the watch ticked away, the fearful Stone Age men removed it from where it lay near Katy's head and loaded it onto one of the log rafts. Only 10 minutes had passed on the watch. The watch face, which wasn't bad for the first jewellery theft in history. Katy woke with a start just as the raft disappeared around the bend. "What's the time?" she asked herself in a panic. She looked to where she had left her wristwatch and saw that it was gone. She looked in the pockets of her jeans, thinking that perhaps she had put it in one of them, and then she found that the tear had gone too. Now Katy was a pretty level-headed girl under normal circumstances, but these circumstances were hardly normal. She stamped her foot down hard, causing a derelict hut in the enclosure a mile away to collapse. "Fred the Nurgla, where are you?" she cried, sending thousands of birds wheeling into the sky. Downriver, the men in the log raft with its loudly ticking burden shivered at the sound of her voice and paddled faster. It seemed ages before Katy heard the Nurgla's voice in her head. "I'm coming," it said, and suddenly he was there at her ankle. "Oh," he said, "I'll come up to you," and he became her size. "What's the matter?" Katy told him between sobs that not only had she lost her watch, but the tear had gone too. The Nurgla was worried. "I should have come with you, and this would not have happened," he said. "I was having a little chat with Tom and Pterodactyl. He's doing a monitoring job for our planet." "What are we going to do?" said Katy, blowing her nose. "The first thing is to find out how many Gloxies we've got left," said the Nurgla reflectively. "How can we do that? There is a way of telling the time on our planet in an emergency. Let me see now. How do we do it?" "Oh, come on, please, do hurry up." "I think I've got it," said the Nurgla, putting his tail in his mouth. and going a particular shade of purple. Slowly, along his side, large green figures appeared. What does it say? The Nurgla's voice was tight with strain. I can't read what it says, said Katy desperately. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll translate it into English. His voice was apologetic. He repeated the process, this time going a delicate pink colour. It says you have 3 minutes to go. Oh dear, I'll never get home now. Katy began to cry, big tears. The Nurgla watched her with pity in his eyes. Then he said, quick, come up and cry over here by these stones. If one of your tears lands on my tear, it will glow a deep red. I don't think I've got any tears left. Katy was having dry sobs now. The figures on the Nurgla's side read, you have 2 minutes to go. Take your hanky out of your pocket. It's soaking wet, said Katy. I know. Wring out your tears over this pile of stones and let's see what happens. Katy fumbled for her handkerchief and came over to where the Nurgla stood. His side now read, you have 1 minute to go. She squeezed her handkerchief as hard as she could, showering the stones with shed tears. That's it. There, cried the Nurgla's voice. Quick, it's under that stone over there. Katy seized it with a cry of happiness and held it tightly. You have 30 seconds to go, read the Nurgla's side. Jump on my back quickly, called the voice in Katy's head. She sat astride his back and shut her eyes tightly. There was a flash of red and the same great rush of wind, and when Katy opened her eyes, she was back in her bedroom, her proper size. Oh, thank you, she cried, hugging the Nurgla. I must go, my dear, he said gently. I've only about 10 of your seconds to get back to my spaceship. He dissolved into a ball of brilliant green light. It came close to Katy, and she felt it caress her face for an instant. When you want me really badly, I'll come to you and tell your friends to take care of this planet Earth. If you don't, you haven't many Gloxies left. Goodbye. And Katy watched the glowing ball fly through her window and out into the night sky. She stood watching it become just a tiny spot of light and then vanish. I shall miss you so much, she said quietly, and taking the tear from her pocket, she kissed it and put it away carefully in the drawer of her dressing table. Back in the Stone Age, Ugg arrived at Bo the Peep's hut, dragging the magical device he had found on the sled made of logs. Before he could say anything, Bo shook him warmly by the right ear. That was how the tribe showed gratitude. You've done a good job on that temple. How did you manage to do it in such a short time? Ugg looked puzzled. Look, over there, said Bo, turning Ugg around and pointing to the grassy plateau behind the village. On it stood a perfect circle of giant stones with other stones placed across the top. Well done. I think I'll call it Stonehenge. You shall have another bone to wear through your nose. Now, what have you got here? Bo examined the strange object from all angles. It's too magical for everybody to see. We must dig a hole and hide it. It will be the deepest hole in the world. Bo was warming to his theme. And then we'll build a great hill on top of it. Come, let's start digging. And Ugg, who didn't really fancy another bone through his nose, picked up his piece of antler horn and, with a deep sigh, started to dig. Katy's mother came into the sitting room and sat down heavily in her favourite chair. I've just been next door to give Mrs. Bramley a bowl of beef tea. She thought she saw a flying saucer last night. Poor woman's going potty. She picked up her knitting. Have you read this? Katy's father looked up from his paper. His wife stared at him. No, she said. You have the paper. Well, it says here that archaeologists excavating around Silbury Hill have come across what appears to be an enormous wristwatch. Fancy that. A Stone Age wristwatch. He shook his head in disbelief. That must be mine, said Katy excitedly. She was looking at the top marks in her history. Her history teacher had given her for a Stone Age essay. I lost it in the Stone Age. Don't be silly, Katy, said her mother with a little sniff. Katy heaved a big sigh and sat back in her chair. They'd never believe me anyway, she thought to herself. Then she put her hand in her pocket and gently massaged the tear pebble. But we know it really happened, don't we, Fred? She whispered, and she felt something like a tiny puff of air caress her cheek, and she smiled a little secret smile. The end.